Cool. Hey, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about why I think the resources available to the effective altruism community have been growing, how that might change our priorities, and why I think it means we should try to be more ambitious. Okay, so the first part of the talk is about whether effective altruism has been growing. So lots of people have been saying that effective altruism isn't growing, and they cite things like this chart, which is the number of people searching for the term effective altruism on Google. And it does indeed look like this isn't growing, which is not ideal. But to get a better picture of the growth of a movement, it's useful to make a couple of distinctions. So the first distinction is between the number of people finding out about effective altruism each year and the total number of people involved. So that's the difference between the flow and the stock. And then the second is it's useful to distinguish between different levels of engagement. So there's a number of people who've just heard about effective altruism, a number of people like kind of reading a lot, and then there's like highly engaged people. And people often call this the top, middle, and bottom of the funnel. So the search volume chart basically shows that the flow into the top of the funnel is not growing. And that is obviously bad. It would be better if all aspects of the funnel were growing. But if I was going to pick just one thing to focus on in order to evaluate whether effective altruism is growing or not, it would be the growth rate of the stock at the bottom of the funnel. Okay, and then that could then further be divided into a couple of different things we could look at. So you can kind of think of the impact of effective altruism as a function of how many people there are, how much funding there is, where the kind of efficiency with which that's turned into impact depends on how good our ideas are. So this is a kind of illustration of that. As you get more funding and people, impact hopefully goes up, though at a diminishing rate. And then if we have better ideas, it kind of shifts how much impact we're able to have with each level of people and funding. There's a lot more complications you could add to this. Like there's probably some complementarities between funding and people and so on, but just as a very rough illustration. So I'm now going to look at the growth in funding and then the growth in people. So earlier this year, I made these estimates of how much funding is committed to effective altruism in total. These are all very rough figures. They could easily vary by a factor of 5 either side. But in total, I added up to about $46 billion. And maybe more strikingly, I estimated that that seems to have grown almost 5-fold since 2015, which is a 37% annual rate of growth. What drove the growth? So one thing was that Dustin Moscovich's net worth, he's the main source of the funds behind Open Philanthropy, has grown a lot as Facebook stock's gone up, and his new company Asana also IPO'd. And then perhaps more strikingly is Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of FTX and Alameda. So we met Sam in 2012 when Will was giving a talk at MIT at a student group event, and he made the arguments for earning to give. And then Sam kind of turned around and actually went and did it. And the Financial Times now estimates that he's the world's richest person under 30. And Forbes recently estimated his net worth is over 20 billion. Actually gone up another 5 or 6 billion since I made the estimates a few months ago. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't have predicted this would have happened back in 2012 when we started 80,000 Hours. It's not just Sam though, all these other sources I think have grown a lot as well since 2015. So for instance, Founders Pledge in 2015 only had under $100 million pledged. And when I made the estimates, I was using a figure of $3 billion pledged. And I've heard that's now actually more like over $5 billion. So there's a lot of growth in the other terms as well. Yeah, that's the stock of available funds. Just to talk about quickly the amount of funding deployed each year, I estimated that's around 400 million. It's just important to remember with this one, it's very lumpy from year to year. So Open Philanthropy accounts for a lot of those funds. And you can see that grew very rapidly from 2015 to 2017. It's very lumpy each year, but then they've held it roughly constant from 2017. But that was a deliberate decision to consolidate their existing cause areas, build up staff capacity. The plan with Open Philanthropy is that good ventures, so Dustin Moskovich and Kerry Tuna, want to spend down all the money before they die. And in order to do that, they will need to hit something more like $1 billion per year fairly soon. So that's definitely expected to go up. Sorry, ignore the 2021 figure, that's incomplete. Okay, so that was funding. Estimating the number of people involved is a lot more difficult. This is my favorite way to do it. This is probably not obeying best practice for slides, but the basic idea is you look at the effective altruism survey, you see how many people say they're engaged, and then you adjust it by the response rate. And the way you estimate the response rate is you take a group like everyone who works at CEA, and then find out exactly how many filled out the survey, and then that gives you a proxy for that. So applying that method in 2019, there was 900 or so people who filled out the survey saying they were very engaged, and then we estimated a 40% response rate. So there was 2,300 like kind of highly engaged members of the community. If you used a kind of a wider definition, then that number would be a lot larger. But just focusing on that kind of that very core at the center. Applying the same method in 2020, around the same number of people said that they were engaged, but we estimated the response rate was a bit lower. So this method ended up with a 13% growth rate. I've tried a number of other methods, and I generally end up with estimates between 0 and 30%. Many ways of estimating it don't really work because they don't take account of the fact that it takes people several years between hearing about effective altruism and getting involved. And so if you look at like 2020 data, it's missing almost everyone who actually came in 2020. Just one interesting thing I was figuring out today is I also estimated last year that around maybe 3% of people leave each year in that group of engagement. That's also very uncertain. But if that holds up, then the stock of the community would eventually tend to around 10,000 people at equilibrium size, if the flow stays constant. So even if we don't grow the number of people getting involved each year, this will naturally drift up to around 10,000, though hopefully we can. Okay, so that was number of people and funding. I just want to do a final bit of this section is just to talk about how that's allocated across issues. So I also made these rough estimates of the breakdown of funding by cause area. This is mainly Open Philanthropy's funding averaged over a couple of years to take account of the lumpiness. And then GiveWell added in, which is so Open Philanthropy is about 60%, then GiveWell 20%. And then I made rough estimates of the remaining 20%. And you can see the big thing here is there's a big allocation to global health, which is driven by GiveWell. The situation for people is, you can take a photo. The situation for people is actually really different. This is people who said 5 out of 5 for engagement on the effective altruism survey. So this is like the kind of most engaged people. But you can see, firstly, they're much more spread out over issues, and then these kind of more meta things and AI are actually at the top when it comes to the most engaged people. This is actually exactly what we should hope for in some ways, because in a cause where you can hire people outside the community to do really useful work, like in global health, then you can deploy lots of funding quickly. And then people who are engaged in effective altruism should focus on the areas where it's hardest to hire people outside of the community. For instance, in movement building, you can't really hire people who don't believe in effective altruism to do movement building for it. And same with like AI alignment, because there's not such an existing field there, you need people who kind of are really into the ideas themselves. So in some ways we should expect quite a different allocation for both funding and people. Some final speculations around what might be the ideal allocation of people across issues. This is, there was a survey in the 2019 Coordination Forum shown in blue there, which is people were asked what would be the ideal fraction of resources to put into each area. And then also shown in red is users of the Effective Altruism Forum in the EA survey, which is about 1,000 people, saying which their top cause preference was. And you can see those two actually line up quite well, which is interesting. Okay, and then now I made this very made up actual figure, which is a combination of people and funding where I used a $100,000 per year conversion rate to get the total in each one. And then I've compared that to one estimate of the ideal portfolio. And what jumps out here potentially, though it's very sensitive to exactly how you aggregate them, is that it seems like global poverty is kind of a bit over-allocated. I wouldn't suggest we cut back funding to global poverty, but rather my hope is that the other causes will be able to grow faster over the next 10 years. The other thing that really leapt out to me perhaps as the biggest gap is actually the bottom one, which is broad long-termism. So that is things like reducing great power conflict and improving institutional decision-making, kind of efforts to make society generally better at dealing with big risks or other important challenges. And people in the survey thought that area should maybe have like 5 to, I think, 15% of resources, depending on the person. But as far as I can tell, it's under 1% currently. So on a kind of proportional basis, that's the thing that's the biggest gap in the portfolio currently. Okay, so that's the first section. The second section is about what might be some of the implications of this, and in particular, what are the implications of how much funding there is now, $46 billion. What should we be doing in response to this? And you could kind of see there being two main options. Option one is just to find the most scalable thing we can find and spend the money as quickly as possible on that. And so within more near-termist issues, that might be something like give directly or other cash transfers, which could absorb billions of dollars of funding and achieve a lot. Within long-termism, it might be something more like green energy research and development, which currently receives $35 billion per year of funding. So you could add billions of dollars to that with probably similar returns to the current amount. Or maybe even better might be some kind of scaling up some kind of existing biosecurity pandemic prevention methods on a kind of like billion-dollar basis. So that's kind of option one. Option two is then to try to find something even more effective than these. And this seems to be what funders are doing currently. Basically funders are holding their bar significantly higher than give directly. And that's because they believe that by waiting and we'll be able to find and also create new opportunities that are significantly more cost effective than give directly, and therefore over the long term have a much bigger impact. So I'd say the kind of current bar for funding within give directly is more around the level of Against Malaria Foundation, which GiveWell estimates is 15 times more cost effective than give directly. So generally charities that are around that level of cost effectiveness, that level of evidence base, and kind of good in the same other ways, have a good shot of getting funding. Within long-termism, it's a bit harder to say where the bar is, but maybe something like projects that have a reasonable shot of doing something useful in AI safety or global catastrophic biorisks have a reasonable shot of getting funded. Which you get to think of as like some of the recent things that have been funded by the Effective Altruism Long-Term Fund. And the hope is that these things might be 10 or even more times more effective than something like green energy R&D. Meta charities would then be expected to provide like a multiplier on either of the other two. To get a more concrete thing, there was a good post on the Effect Altruism forum recently, which is called List of EA Funding Opportunities, and it kind of lists like specific places you can get funding from, which also helps to give an idea of what funders are currently focusing on. Okay, so one point I want to make about this is like these are hard bars to clear. Like green energy R&D might well be one of the best things within climate change, and we're saying people are trying to find things that are like 10 or 100 times more cost effective than that, and same within global health versus give directly. It's even harder to clear those bars if you take account of funders are going to be worried about things like the estimates being too optimistic, discount rates, opportunity costs, lots of other complications. So a startup charity might well need to be targeting a level that's like even 10 times higher than those bars again, with the expectation that it will come down over time. So that is that's kind of really the challenge that the community faces, is like, can we prove these funders right and actually generate all these opportunities that they're hoping to find and perhaps even expecting to find, and therefore have much greater impact with this money than if we just donated it all now. And so this means, like in terms of careers, there are these opportunities to do a lot more, have a lot more impact than something like earning to give and then donating to give directly, which is already an extremely impactful level. Like, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if something like earning to give and giving to give directly was more impactful than like 98% of jobs that people take. And you know, it's really making a big difference in the lives of hundreds of people over the course of your career. But because of this huge amount of funding, there's an opportunity to go even beyond that. And here are some of the things that seem like priorities based on it. So the first would be active grant makers, so people able to help find and also kind of cultivate opportunities and projects that are above those funding bars that I mentioned before. Yeah, if you're earning to give currently, this could be the kind of direction you could take your giving in. Can you get into the position where you could be like an angel donor in effective altruism and spotting things that like other donors aren't yet spotting? That's a really valuable way of kind of adding value as a donor currently. Secondly, we need researchers to figure out what these kind of ideas for spending this a lot more funding above the bar would be, or other ways to make the portfolio more effective. We need people founding projects that are more at this level of cost effectiveness. We need managers who are able to take the projects that are already there and help scale them up and kind of reach their full potential. And then we also need people doing movement building to find all the people, those types of people above. And yeah, there's also a big need for like feeder roles and supporting roles for all of these kinds of things. So things like being a research assistant, all types of organization building roles like operations management, office management, recruiting, things like that. Yeah, I would kind of roughly say that if I had to put an estimate on it, so you could imagine we could magically create someone who's earning to give, donating certain amounts of money each year, or we could magically create someone who's like a good fit for one of these roles, especially the more senior versions. I would often prefer the person to around like millions of dollars of funding per year, in some cases over $10 million. So that's just kind of a rough way that I would try to kind of quantify the value of some of these positions in terms of earning to give. Yeah, you could kind of scale those figures down for the more junior equivalents. Okay, and so then based on this, I would say some rough priorities early career. Oh yeah, actually just before that, these things here are just the roles that impact has been changed by the funding situation. But there's loads of roles that don't require funding from the effective altruism community that are still really impactful, and they're still impactful. So just some quick examples of those would be, you know, people could have a lot of impact by improving things in government and policy, but they don't require funding to do that. They can just take those positions. And just wanted to flag, I'm not talking about all positions here, just the ones that have been changed by the funding situation. Just as another example, lots of people could say work in journalism or the media and promote really neglected and pressing issues and have a big impact doing that. And again, they don't particularly need funding from effective altruism to do that necessarily. Okay, and so here's like a very, very rough early career priorities based on those roles. So I'd say like a big priority early would be trying to test out your fit for those roles. And then like if you find a good opportunity, aiming at them. Secondly, there's building career capital for those roles, or building career capital for like 20 years in the future when effective altruism will hopefully be a lot bigger and it will need a much wider range of skills. So yeah, skills needed become broader over time. And then a third option is to just find a job that's a good fit, and then on the side, don't just donate, but you could also do community building and kind of being a sensible advocate for some of these effective altruism issues, I think, can be a route to having just as much impact and perhaps more than donating. Yeah, if you're currently earning to give, then I would say it's kind of worth seriously doing a round of, say, like applying to these types of roles and seeing whether there's any opportunities that are a good fit. So kind of seriously considering switching, though many people it will be the best role for many people in the end. Yeah, in the past, I think I've been kind of helped to be fairly confusing a couple of times. One was by talking about talent constraints, the community being talent constrained. It makes it sound like it's easy to get a job. And then by more recently talking about there being a funding overhang, it makes it sound like it's easy to get funding. Unfortunately, none of those two things are true. It's more accurate to say something like, if you're, don't use those terms, if you're able to find opportunities that are much more effective than these funding bars, which are very, very high, then there's a lot of funding available. But it's not easy to think of something that's like 10 times more effective than something that's already among the most effective things, which is earning to give directly, or the EA long-term fund. I should probably also be clear that like allocation in the community is definitely not perfect. So there's going to be some good projects that are indeed above the bar, but getting missed. So that's always a risk. So the kind of way I would suggest kind of orienting towards this is try to like set up your life so that you can afford to fail. So make sure you have a backup plan, things like that. And then given that, try and like aim as high as you can. So the kind of slogan would be like, find ways to limit your downsides and then aim high. And so we can apply that on an individual level. And then I think also from the community, we can also stand to be more ambitious. There's many reasons why to be more ambitious. Partly there's the kind of general case that people who want to have an impact can afford to take more risks than people who are just in it for themselves personally. There's a kind of old school effective altruism argument. The kind of two new points which I want to emphasize today is that firstly, I think recent events has kind of shown that the community can achieve like really, really big things on the kind of by anyone's standards. So coming back just briefly to Sam's story, back in 2015, there was probably only around 1,000 highly engaged people in the community. And so if like one of those has become the world's richest person under 30, that's like a pretty good base rate out of 1,000 people. Those are pretty good odds. And I've seen people like kind of succeeding ahead of what I would have expected in other career paths as well. Just many people in effective altruism are just really capable of achieving a lot. And another interesting thing about Sam is like, Sam had a lot going for him and like, has a really privileged background of like, his parents are both Stanford law professors, I think. But one of his other really notable traits is that he aimed really high. I mean, he probably took the idea of becoming a billionaire more seriously than like almost anyone else in the community. And I think that was maybe also necessary for his success. Okay, so that's kind of showing that like maybe we could raise our sights, that it is possible. The second point is that now there's just like a lot more funding available. So that should mean that we're able to do things that just weren't possible 5 or 10 years ago. Kind of in contrast to that, though, a lot of effective altruism projects look quite similar to how they did back in 2015. Many of them would kind of struggle to deploy more than $10 million per year effectively. And like 80,000 hours is definitely in that category. Like our kind of programs are the same as before there was all this funding. But it seems like, looking forwards, we should be thinking about projects that are potentially a lot more scalable than our current ones. If you think the challenge is like we're currently deploying 400 million a year, but we need to get that to above $1 billion a year, either we're going to have to massively grow the community, or we're going to have to set up projects that can deploy a lot more funding effectively than the current projects, like at those higher bars of funding that I mentioned earlier. So people have been talking about this idea of mega projects, where this is just defined as a project that could cost effectively deploy $100 million a year rather than $10 million a year, which is like where many of the current projects are. I don't know what these projects should be. Some kind of very rough ideas that have been floating around. One is something like a global screening program to detect new pathogens to help with biosecurity. Another is an effective altruism-inspired school or university. A third would be to step into and trying to become the biggest funders of nuclear security, because the biggest funder, MacArthur Foundation, has recently quit that area. So that could be another opportunity. And there's a couple of talks about that at the conference. So that's kind of that's another way of seeing the challenge. What might these mega projects be, and how could we get them started? And yeah, it would be really exciting if something like this could emerge from this conference. So I hope that is something to think about for the rest of the weekend. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. And if you want to submit questions, you can do so on the Swapcard app. So you sort of talk about impact of the community as in part a function of the quality of our ideas. Do you think that our ideas have improved over time? If so, why? If not, how do we get it moving in the right direction?
Yeah, that one's a lot harder, so I didn't discuss it in my Is Effect Altruism Growing post, though it might actually be more important than kind of growth of people or funding. As to how they've been going, I would probably say, one way of thinking about this is basically just like how cost effectively are we able to spend funding at the margin compared to what we would have guessed 5 years ago. Which it would be really interesting if someone wanted to do more thorough research into that. Within global health, it seems like the level is around the same, though it does require constant work to keep finding new charities at the current level of effectiveness. And I guess I would say within long-termism, it also seems like currently the top ranked cause would still be AI safety. So in a way, that's a slightly bleak picture, I guess, of, constant effectiveness.
Yeah. So I guess like also the discovery of new cause areas, that might be some evidence that we would, which I guess we had 6 years ago, but haven't since.
So there have been some things. So I would say some of the more interesting things that have been opening up are, back in 2015, people weren't really talking about AI policy as an area. It was just mainly AI technical safety. We kind of almost forget that now because it seems so obvious. Broad long-termism was also much less of a thing. I thought some of Phil's work on patient long-termism was potentially a pretty big contribution. The kind of best guess things around direct existential risk reduction have stayed constant, but I'd say there is progress in some of those other areas.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the skill level of people in the community, obviously Sam's story sort of is some indication that generally as a community we have a lot of highly skilled people within it. Do you think our skill level's increased? And is it just that we're just kind of getting older and more experienced, or is there something else at play?
Yeah, so earlier I should have said we don't just care about the number of people, but also we obviously care a lot about how skilled they are, what they're able to do. And I think that's actually also grown a lot over time. And perhaps the biggest driver of that is just that roughly the community gets 1 year older every year, which is, because there's only 10% or so, 10-20% of people joining, so even if the joiners are younger, it's not enough to change the average that much. And that means that compared to back in 2015, people are in much more senior positions than they were back then. And that can really result in a lot of extra impact. That kind of becoming more senior effect could easily mean that our impact goes up by tenfold over 10 or 20 years just by itself. So I think there's been a lot of kind of growth there. Mm-hmm.
And that will just naturally keep getting better, which is great as time passes.
Yep, hopefully.
So the funding constraint, talent constraint questions, obviously nice big X on the screen. You hear people talk about it all the time, referencing articles that you've written. So as the author of these articles, how would you define the terms? And if you could kind of inject nuance into those conversations, what kind of nuance would you inject?
Yeah, so one very clear way to think of the terms is just in terms of you can just compare earning to give versus a direct work opportunity, and then think about how much that person would need to donate in order to have as much impact as the direct work opportunity. And then basically the higher that figure, the more talent constrained that opportunity is. Does that make sense? You can just think of it as the ratio between those two is the degree of funding versus talent constraints. And there's some issues with that way of thinking, but I think it's at least a very conceptually clear way of thinking about funding versus talent constraints. And then I think the other big point I'd want to add is it's not very helpful to just say talent constraints in general. it's usually a lot clearer to try to talk about a specific profile of person or skill set. So I was trying to introduce the term skill bottlenecks and then talking about specific skill bottlenecks rather than just talking about talent constraints in general. And yeah, you can kind of see that playing out in the talk where when we were saying like, well, there's like talent constraints, what we actually mean is like people able to fill those opportunities that create value much more cost effectively than the scalable funding bar. Those things, it's like valuable to have those compared to loads of funding. But that's like a long way from it being like easy to get jobs in general. It's more like if you're able to fill these very specific positions that are like not easy to fill, then it's like there's a large amount of funding.
Mm-hmm. And so a question from the audience. It seems like to found a mega project, they're likely to be outliers on a number of axes. So if somebody wanted a 1+% chance of founding a mega project in 10 years' time, what experience do you think might be valuable to gain right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like not clear to me how hard it is. I think it's easy to maybe overestimate how hard it is. When we see people outside of effective altruism who've like achieved really like conventionally big things, it's not obvious, like it's not clear exactly what they have that people in the community don't have. I think one big thing a lot of people have, like Elon Musk is a good example, is just like thinking of something really ambitious and then just being like really earnest about actually doing it, which like almost no one does. So, you know, and that was kind of like the attitude that Sam had as well. So I do think just having that like actually trying trait might already kind of like give you more than a 1% chance depending on like what else you have. Yeah, in terms of the best way to prepare for it, I mean, I think if you're like at this conference, then I might almost just say try to kind of get started. And so like, well, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, like how to think of good startup ideas, which is obviously a huge topic. But if you kind of do have an idea already, then it would just be about testing it out on a small scale, seeing if funders are interested, and then kind of if they are, going for it, and then gradually scaling it up. Mm-hmm. But then if not, if you're kind of not at that stage yet, then it's a case of like trying to go and work in the cause area where you would want to found this mega project, and then making sure you know everyone in the cause area, ideally running something on a smaller scale, so like working in a small but quickly growing organization, where you can kind of try out lots of different parts of running an organization. This is kind of, you're aiming to be the entrepreneur running it. And then like while you're doing that, try to kind of be testing out side projects on the, as you go and seeing if any of those might develop into a good idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, so taking risks can be pretty scary though, so especially with things like our careers. And is this kind of upside like the main reason you think altruists should take more risks? Yeah, well, I think there's like actually like a lot of arguments for why altruists might consider taking more risks. Like kind of one I alluded to in the talk is this idea that like if you can do twice as much good, you can help twice as many people, then that's twice as valuable, which sounds almost kind of obvious, but that's not how things are in our personal lives. So like having twice as many friends doesn't make you like twice as happy. Whereas like losing one friend is like much worse than much worse than the goodness of gaining one friend. So in our personal lives, we have like diminishing returns, which means we should be risk averse, and we also have loss aversion. But it's like not obvious that either of these should really apply to someone who's aiming to have an impact. So the kind of like value of taking a small probability but high upside bet is much better from an impact point of view compared to our personal lives. And so that partly means it's like more worth it. It also means we might expect that within the world of doing good, many existing kind of actors are going to be much more risk averse than us, which could then also mean there's kind of those opportunities are especially neglected, the kind of high upside but like low probability ones, which you could then turn into another argument for aiming really high. And I guess this like links to being ambitious. So when we talk about being ambitious, what else might we mean? Are you mainly just talking about your career or?
Yeah, well, okay, so I guess it'd be better if I was giving more an inspiring ending, but I mean, if you want to get really precise about being ambitious, the kind of technical thing I mean is you could kind of think of all the options open to you, and then think about how good they would be in the 95th percentile scenario. So like, if things go well, but not like insane, like not like kind of unbelievably well, but just like very solidly well, then like choose the project that looks best on that process. So it's kind of like choose the thing which looks best in an upside scenario, like if things go ahead of your expectations. And that's kind of a way of like formalizing this aim higher idea that I was talking about. I think kind of another aspect of it is just like actually trying to think of things that could be really big for the community, like mega projects.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of mega projects, so you listed a few. Are there any that you're really excited about, or you wish somebody at this conference would just sort of get going on?
I haven't thought about specifically which mega projects that much, so I'll probably defer that question and kind of say like that's really for the audience to figure out.
Yeah, great. So if we feel that our interventions are more effective than mainstream efforts to change the world, don't we have an obligation to reach larger audiences? So I guess top of funnel things. But this is still a niche community. Like where are all the boomers? Can we generate interest from celebrities and achieve an Oprah moment that spreads this movement widely?
So I definitely think growing the movement is one of the top priorities, and I listed movement builders as one of the key roles that I'm keen to see more people filling. I should have also said earlier when I was talking about like how search traffic for effective altruism isn't growing, it's definitely a big priority to get that growing again. And I mentioned that back in 2017, many groups slightly deprioritized how much they focused on kind of broad outreach in order to basically focus on kind of helping people who are already interested in effective altruism, like actually find good jobs, get training. Like there was a lot of other problems in the community. Like there was lots of interested people, but they wasn't being converted into action. We kind of still have that problem, but I think it's a bit less bad than 2017. And so then now I'm like thinking we should be more focusing again at the top of the funnel and getting more people interested. I actually see that as like 80,000 hours as biggest priority now is growing our audience of readers and getting new people interested in effective altruism. There's a whole separate question about how best to do that. It's not obvious to me that like kind of very broad approach with like celebrities would be the best one, as opposed to a kind of like more targeted thing among niche communities. I just saw that like FTX had started sponsoring Magic the Gathering YouTube.
Nice.
They have their YouTube channel, like maybe like that kind of thing. I don't know. That's what we're trying to figure out at the minute, is like what are the best ways of growing the community at the margin.
Nice. And apart from the obviously excellent 80,000 hours, what other resources do you think are out there that will help the community do this? The thing we've been, I think the Precipice has been one of the biggest things growing the community over the last year or two. I guess also it's maybe worth mentioning like the Sam Harris podcast seems to be a big source of people in the last year or two. So like Will's conversation there. I would quite like the community to have better intro materials, because like doing good better is a good introduction for a certain type of person, but then it does tend to kind of encourage people to think that effective altruism is mainly about like saving lives in the developing world. So it kind of like opens with the burning building example, like and like if you read all the critiques of it, it's all based around like, well, like aid doesn't always work, those kinds of objections. It would be cool to have more materials that like introduce effective altruism, but covering the broader range of causes, or just introducing it with like other principles brought to the forefront, so that they like appeal to different people. So maybe we need an updated Doing Good Better.
Well, yeah, I have pitched this to Will, and he will consider it, but he has to finish his long-termism book first.
Yeah. Right, yeah. And I think the Precipice definitely, like I've got a bookshelf of the Precipice at home, and I sort of like hand it out fervently.
Yeah, just unfortunately the Precipice doesn't like pitch effective altruism itself, so that would be the kind of gap.
Yeah. How much more effective do you think it is to be a full-time community builder versus earning to give and give directly? If it's much more effective, should 80,000 hours do more to make a community building make it community building higher status in the community?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of gave my figures earlier. Like, I think like millions of dollars could be plausible, though, with all the normal caveats that this would be like if you're a good fit for the role, and like it's a role that's like actually doing something that's working, and kind of basically it needs to be going well. Yeah, I mean, we have been trying to make it higher status. Like, we added a local group leader to our list of other paths recently, and yeah, hopefully we'll be talking more about like movement building and community roles going forward.
Great. And I guess as an organisation, how is 80,000 hours strategies changing as a result of there being more funding, or is it changing?
I mean, we've actually like slightly struggled to figure out exactly what we should do differently. I mean, I think in one way it changes our strategy. Is it changes which roles are valuable for us to find towards the ones that I just mentioned. Yeah, I mean, it also kind of means like if we find those roles, they're like higher impact than before, so that's kind of nice. In terms of like whether we could actually deploy a lot more funding, I think it is challenging because like a lot of our programs are not designed to basically use like millions and millions of dollars. They're more designed to use like highly skilled people, which is the thing that we're short of. But we will be trying to see if we can spend a lot more on marketing and see if that works.
And could that deploy tens of millions of dollars, do you think?
No.
No.
But like maybe millions fairly quickly.
Yeah. And I guess if you had to conceive of ATK in this kind of funding environment, do you think you would have built it differently? Yeah, I'm not sure about the answer to that, because I mean, I definitely still think there should be like someone in the community doing the things that we're doing. So yeah, I mean, maybe it would have just been less likely that I would have started doing 80,000 hours itself and done another effective altruism mega project instead, if this had been 10 years ago. But yeah, I would like still hope there would be something similar to 80,000 hours. Yeah. So when people, you hear from people that have like heard about EA, but they've on kind of first hearing about it, they get quite an in-groupy kind of impression. Do you have thoughts on like how much of an issue this is, and what might we do to address it?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. I guess in terms of addressing it, I generally try to kind of think about like what's like the next step for the community. So like the next step isn't going to be making it like super mainstream in one go, and that could actually be really risky. We could like easily lose the people who we're most keen to appeal to, and like really dilute the ideas and things like that. So the kind of key question to figure out is like, for the kind of like next level of people, so if we've got like 2,000 highly engaged people and like 7,000 community members and maybe like tens of thousands of people who are reading, consider like the next 10x of people around that. What are their main objections to effective altruism, and like what do they not like about the community, and then how can we fix those things? Yeah, that's the exercise. And then like, yeah, I don't have the answers to that. That would be like another thing for us to be thinking about.
Right. I think the podcast also goes a long way to making, EA approachable. Like you meet a lot of people who interact with the podcast and just feel very positively towards it, and it's just a great first exposure to the ideas. Yeah, no, I think that's a big advantage of conversations, is like you get a bit of sense of these like are reasonably nice people in a way that you don't get from like reading blog posts. Great. And then final question before we wrap up. So if you had one thing you wanted people to take away from this talk and sort of do at this conference, what would it be? It's like trying to think of ways to use that big pot of funding, and then trying to think like, how can you set up your life so you've like limited your downsides, you have a backup plan, and then what might aiming high look like for you? What might be those projects that like if they went really ahead of your expectations would be really, really impactful? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ben. Please join me in thanking Ben.